This talk is really meant to be a discussion of kind of what is the possible future of when we start to include agents in cross-team collaboration. And some of the signals that I want to bring into this is that people are not going to go away. I think that all of this discussion about how different roles might be diminished in this future world is something to be still figured out. But by and large, there's a real value to having cross-functional teams working with each other from a bunch of different viewpoints, and then adding in the way that agents, mostly focused on, say, small tasks today from a coding standpoint. But there's lots of different ways that an agent could be involved. And this talk, I'm going to be using actually 3 different design fictions, which design fiction is really it's a way to encode basically a provocation into an image. And I'm going to be showing you some things that are meant to be kind of weird, maybe not so weird, but also about this future where we're not only taking all of the work that is happening now with coding agents and the way that extends the team and the capability of engineering, but also how does that start to include all of the different functions, like not only product managers, designers, but also potentially customer support, legal, privacy, security, go-to-market, any of those different groups. And so with that, I want to first talk about how internal to GitHub, we've been thinking a lot about how we use these agents, not only in those coding experiences, but also, say, doing a kickoff as a group. And so what you could imagine is that when we need to do a kickoff today, we usually get into a room, we spend about an hour or so thinking through what we actually need to achieve. And that could include goals, it could include alignment with the broader strategy or values of an organization. And we need to start to break down this information. And a lot of spec-driven development that is coming up today is really about this idea of planning. And what I guess I'm wondering about is, how do we now start to join these very high abstraction things that tend to be, how do we understand the strategy and goals of something, all the way down to planning, which is how do we break this out so that both people and agents can start to take on these individual tasks into the actual code that takes place. And so this is meant to be really just a provocation of where a kickoff meeting may be including both humans and agents. And inside of this, we could start to have different topics. So in this case, it's maybe a hypothetical feature where we want to have a random surprise provocation being sent to someone every day to help them think more broadly about their role and about the work that they do. And as we start to kick this off, we normally talk about what is maybe the intent, like the future intent of this particular project. But we start to then break out what are all the different viewpoints that we would need to have in this world. And automatically, we could start to include agents that might come from those different viewpoints, along with the other people that are already in the room, like product design, engineering, et cetera. This would then start to spin off not only planning from a spec-driven development standpoint, but also potentially multiple prototypes, potential future impacts, predictions, the idea of like decision frameworks and assumptions and tripwires that may make us reconsider what is going on. And part of what we can start to include in all of this information is not only just this kind of interaction back and forth, which tends to be kind of clunky and a lot of paper cuts of trying to bring in multiple agents. Like I have a couple different basically GitHub spaces that will play different roles for me. But it's weird to have to pause, load the context from the current meeting, and then read off of this stuff as a group. And so maybe these things should be part of a screen that is inside of the room that you're working in that automatically are starting to chime in or provide kind of provocation or advice around what is going on. And we can then start to use signals, not only from the agents as far as what their context, their bias, their kind of their viewpoint is bringing to this, but also how do now human beings start to engage with this. And you could imagine that even using something like body language, eye tracking to be able to see what is actually most interesting for us to now discuss, and allowing for this ability for both agents and humans to then engage in some way that really builds a better understanding overall of what we're trying to build, and also spins off all of the different artifacts that we may need, like a plan, like a prototype, like even an initiative brief or a PRD or something like that. And what we then go to is this idea that generally planning today mostly follows some type of regular schedule. Like if you were doing something like a sprint, you may meet every week, you may meet every couple weeks, you may do planning on a quarter. But going from really this idea of like Chronos calendar-based planning to more kind of narrative event-driven planning also means that these types of agents can start to automatically, almost like Google alerts on steroids, going out into the world and trying to understand not only, say, competitive environment, but also the idea of behavioral metrics that are coming out of your particular projects or user research or beta testing, and start to then automatically trigger these points where the underlying assumptions of the actual project have in some way been violated. And now we need to go back in and discuss what actually happened here and what we should now do to either change our plans based on some, in this case, like there's some type of like beta testing that has shown that it's not actually going to work out the way we thought it was. And so this should then create another discussion between not only the people that are helping guide and curate the context of this particular project, but also the agents and what they should be doing next. And I guess one metric I've seen occasionally is this idea of like time to intervention for agents. And right now, I would say it's probably in the range of seconds to minutes, where it can kind of go off and do its own. If you look at something like VenBench, definitely this idea of like decoherence over time starts to happen for agents. But as we start to improve the technologies, as we start to do a better job of including the right context and molding and curating that context, that intervention could go to infinity potentially. And so the question becomes like, what is the appropriate split of decision-making between humans and agents, and which things will agents be the best for doing a decision, like say taking on a particular bug or task, but also this idea of like, this is a critical decision that really a human should be making, because that human is actually then signing off on all of the things that come out of that in some way. And so there's a lot actually for us to consider and to figure out when we start to think beyond just coding when it comes to agents, and how do we start to involve more of the cross-functional teams? How do we really create the best tensions within teams to be able to build the most important and interesting work that we can do? And so, you know, in this case, like what assumptions should be triggering different rituals? Is this something that only humans should do, or should also other types of agents be considering when one of these rituals needs to be enacted, like a kickoff or a quick meeting to understand a new direction? How do we make decisions when not everything in the room is actually a person? When should we listen to an agent, and when should we ignore or just not even ask for the agent's opinion? And then, you know, should agents actually be there just to build? Should they be there to propose new things to build? Should they provoke us to think differently? Should they persuade us even? Or should they just be there to be like a neutral advisor based on their viewpoint, bias, and kind of context? And then finally, you know, what does alignment really mean? Like we want to have agents because we want them to do great work, and we want them to do work that is helpful, but sometimes that work needs to be surprising. And so if we have pure alignment, that actually reduces surprise and innovation within these teams. And so how do we decide what is the correct amount of alignment, not only between people, which has always been a hard problem, but also now with these agents? And so with that, thank you very much.